Okay, so the last video I was showing you the different ways to solve a quadratic equation. They were already set up, equal to 0. We had an x squared term, an x term, and a constant. There is another way to solve a quadratic equation. It's called the square root property, and we use it when we just have something squared equal to a number. Okay, so we have x squared equals 81. The square root property says that you can take the square root of both sides of the equation, just like you can add, subtract, multiply, or divide. As long as you do the same thing to one side of the equation that you do to the other, then you're fine. So I'm going to take the square root of x squared, and I'm going to take the square root of 81. Okay, the square root of x squared will give me x. The square root of 81 will give me either plus or minus 9. Realize when you take the square root, you need the plus or minus, okay? Because look, the original equation was what squared equals 81. Well, 9 squared equals 81, and negative 9 squared equals 81. You need to put that plus or minus there. Okay, so there we got two rational answers. Here, just because I can't take the square root of 7 and get a rational number doesn't mean I don't do the same exact thing. Okay, it's just that instead of getting a rational number, I get an irrational one. Two of them, actually. Positive square root of 7 and negative square root of 7. Okay, so sometimes you get rational numbers, sometimes irrational. Sometimes your x squared is not isolated. So you have to have, I can't start taking the square root of both sides until I just have something squared. Okay, so I'm going to have to subtract 10. I have 3x squared equals negative 6. I'll divide by 3. I have x squared equals negative 2. Okay, and then I take the square root of both sides. X equals plus or minus the square root of negative 2, which I would write as plus or minus I squared to 2. It's imaginary. I couldn't solve the problem until I got that x squared all by itself. Okay, so same thing here. I have something squared. It's just that what I have that's squared is this entire x minus 3. That's okay. I am still going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, the square root of something squared is just that something. So I have x minus 3 equals plus or minus I square root of 12. Okay, now 12, of course, is 4 times 3. So I can make this x plus 3 equals plus or minus 2I square root of 3. Okay, since 12 is 4 times 3, square root of 4 is 2, I can pull that out. I will, of course, subtract 3 from both sides. X equals negative 3 plus or minus 2I square root of 3. Okay, so that's how you use the square root property. Now, sometimes the square root property is hidden. We did a little bit of this with circles. Okay, I don't have something squared here. Okay, sometimes, like, see how back here I had x minus 3 quantity squared? If you don't, you can always make it a perfect square trinomial. Let's say that I have x squared minus 10x equals 3. Okay, and I'm like, I'd like to use the square root property. If you want to use the square root property, you're going to have to take and make this a perfect square trinomial by taking half the middle term, half of 10 is 5, and squaring it and adding it to both sides. The reason we do that is so that then we can write x minus 5 squared equals 28. 25 plus 3. Okay, so I added 25 to both sides so that I have a perfect square trinomial, so that I can solve it the way I did this one. I have something squared equals something. Okay, and once I have that, Okay, I took the x squared minus 10x plus 25, rewrote it as x minus 5 quantity squared. Now I can take the square root of both sides and say that x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 28. So x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 28, which means it's 5 plus or minus, let's see, 28 is 4 times 7. Square root of 4 is 2. So we have x equals 5 plus or minus 2 square roots of 7. Okay, it's just another way to solve. I'm trying to show you all the multiple ways. Remember that math is like pasta. Lots of different ways to make pasta, lots of different ways to solve quadratic equations. Just be careful if, and we did this with circles. If you have a problem like this, x squared plus 5x, let's say, equals 7, and I want to use this square root method, then I have to take half of 5 and square it. Half of 5 is 5 over 2. Squared is 25/4. So I'll have to add 25/4 to both sides. Okay. And then, okay, so I took half of 5, which is 5 over 2, and I squared it and got 25/4. The reason I did that is so that I could write this as x plus 5 halves squared equals, let's see, 7 is what, 28/4? So 28 and 25, I have 53/4. Okay, now I can take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of both sides, I get x plus 5 halves equals plus or minus the square root of 53/4. Okay, and when I do that, I'll subtract the 5 halves to the other side. So I have negative 5 halves plus or minus the square root of 53/2. Notice I took the square root of 4 and just have 2 on the bottom. You might even see it written as negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 53 all over 2. Okay, it's the square root method. You might not use that method. You might not like that method, but it is a method that's sometimes used. Let's look at this one. X squared minus 3/5 x. If I was going to complete that square, sometimes people have trouble with this. If you have to complete this square, you have to take half the middle term. So I sometimes go off to the side and just write, what's half of 3/5? It's 3/10. Okay, you take half the middle term and you square it. So this is going to be x squared minus 3/5 x plus 9/100. Okay, and what we write it that way so that I can have a binomial squared, and then I can use my square root method. So if you have a fraction as your middle coefficient and you have to take half of it, it might help just to go over to the side and take half of it this way. And then remember that you square it. That's what you add here. That way it's a perfect square trinomial that can be written as x minus whatever half the middle term was squared. Okay. All righty. The homework is in your book. Okay. It's on page 141, 142. Everybody has their book now. I want you to do 5 to 14 all, it's a little bit of matching, and then 15 to 33 odd. Please do all this homework. The quadratic is, we'll use it the rest of the year. Please do this homework. If you didn't do any others all year, do this homework. All right, open your book and give yourself time to do this, please. Okay? All righty, I'll see you in school.